Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another live stream here on the Kennedy Report. Still working out some of the technological stuff, so make sure if the audio is off or anything. I think it should be good. Let me know. I've downloaded some videos this time to make sure that I will be able to play them with the proper sound. You know, we're learning around here. We're going to talk today about, or tonight, I guess, or today, I guess, if you're in Australia, or I guess what time would it be in Eastern Europe? Might be like 6 in the morning. Anyway, we're going to talk about Jordan Peterson. So I'm a big Jordan Peterson fan, and I've been following him for a long time. I'm going to tell you that story as we go through some of his conversion moments throughout this stream. But there's something pretty incredible that was posted by Scott Hahn, a famous biblical scholar at a Franciscan university at Steubenville. And we're going to get to that in just a second. But first, we got to say thank you to our sponsor. So you're probably thinking to yourself, what kind of investments are good for the future? You've probably tried different investments, mutual funds, stocks, so on and so forth. You know the market can be volatile. But with inflation running at its highest rate in 40 years, and I think it's probably higher than anywhere here in parts of Canada, you don't want volatility and you don't want uncertainty. Being able to sleep at night knowing your investment isn't about to crash is worth its weight in gold. Well, pun intended. We're literally speaking of gold. If you've been jumping from one investment idea to the next, a gold IRA with Noble Gold is perfect for you. A reliable hedge against inflation just fell in our laps. With gold, you shield your gains from taxes, you keep the real value of your wealth, you own a global asset, something tangible, and you can help protect your wealth against an economic crash. What's not to like? And this month, for every IRA above 20,000, above 20K, you'll get an incredible 3-ounce silver American Virtue coin, completely free as a thank you. That is a cash value. Call 1-877-646-5347, 1-877-646-5347 to find out more. Visit noblegoldinvestments.com. That's noblegoldinvestments.com. You can also find all of the information that you need for that in the links in the description of this video. Okay, thank you to Noble Gold for being a sponsor of the podcast. This makes this all possible. Okay, so what is happening with Jordan Peterson? Well, I'm going to share a clip here or a screen from Scott Hahn's Facebook. I don't have Facebook. That's not true. I have a Facebook account that I've used before to research stuff for my job at LifeSite. So you can see here, I'll just zoom this up a little bit here. Okay, here is a image of Scott Hahn's Facebook page. This was posted a couple nights ago. He says, I was just on the phone with Peter Kraft. Say a prayer. He's about to meet privately with Jordan Peterson. Well, if you didn't know, Jordan Peterson had actually been spending some time at Steubenville University as of late. He actually did, maybe something like a commencement speech. Okay. And I didn't watch the speech. I've got great respect for Steubenville, and I've known many wonderful people that have come out of there. I don't know what the speech was about in the fullness. All I do know, I saw a couple clips, and essentially what happened was, is Jordan Peterson was talking about the message of carrying your cross. Okay, so you can actually see that right here. I have it pulled up. We're not going to play it because it's long, but here's Jordan Peterson at Steubenville University. He actually posted the video on his own channel. The lesson from the Bible will make you unstoppable. Talks about carrying your cross. I watched a few clips. Basically talks about Jordan Peterson's path through suffering. Not sure why he's doing the little spinny wheel thing. But in any case, so Peterson's been cozying up to a lot of the sort of Catholic world. Now, if you're not aware of Jordan Peterson's past, he's made quite the transition as a thinker. I've been watching him for a lot of years, even long before he was famous in the international sense. He's Canadian, so that means that long before he had reached fame and had exploded onto the international scene, if you don't remember when that happened, that was in 2016. It was just around the time my second child was born, and he came out with this video where he was basically, lambasting this new sort of unconscious bias, subconscious racism thing that was going to be taught to professors at the University of Toronto. And he basically, just from a psychological perspective and perspective of just being a sane person, looked at it and went, this is absolute nonsense. So he did this quick video that was pretty good, breaking it down and saying that this is just absolutely bananas. Now, the thing is, I already knew about Jordan Peterson because he had been, let's say, regionally well known in southwestern Ontario and Ontario in general for being a professor. So, you know, if you ever watch public access television, or if you listen to NPR if you're in the States, or CBC Radio in Canada, or BBC Radio in the UK, or something like that, in a saner time, and they were saner times a few years ago, you could hear voices like Jordan Peterson's on the radio, and people wouldn't be screeching about transphobia and so on and so forth. In fact, there was actually a radio program in Canada, I'm talking 5 or 6 years ago, where they actually spoofed the idea of letting your child pick how to identify, and they made a thing about being trans species, and it was a comedy sketch, and it was on Justin Trudeau's CBC Radio, if you can imagine. Things have changed. So Jordan Peterson was on this, and I watched a lot of his lectures. You know, as I had discovered, I had this sort of crisis of faith in my early mid-20s. I was looking for people who were smart, who were talking about religion, and I stumbled across him. I didn't know what to think of him, but I knew that he was just remarkably intelligent. I don't agree with everything he's ever said. I don't agree with everything that most people have ever said, I guess, except for like Christ. But, you know, he's the kind of guy where if you were to walk up to him and say, hey, Jordan, could you give me your opinion on the color red? He'd probably say, well, it depends on what you mean by opinion. It depends on what you mean by red. And how do you perceive color? And he wouldn't just be blowing smoke. You could sit there and have a conversation with him, and within 40 minutes, you probably would have just got to the point where you finally defined your terms about what you meant by color, what you meant by opinion, and what you meant by red. And you probably would have learned something about yourself and virtue. There's something about him where he can really bring things down to the studs of an idea. It takes a really remarkable intellect to do that sort of thing. So he's been doing this for years. And when I found him years ago, he made fascinating arguments for the psychology of why it was actually good to be a religious person. I found those things fascinating because we live in a world where, Mike McCann in the chat says, in conclusion, the color red will send you to the gulag. Yeah, exactly. Also, thank you, Diane. Hit the like and subscribe button. Subscribe to the Kennedy Report. Thank you. But anyway, he's quite a fascinating fella. There's so much that more can be said about him, but he's gone from this position of being someone who's sort of taking just a rational approach to somebody who's actually taken an approach where he seems to have supernatural faith, and grace seems to be working in his life. We're going to go through a clip here that I have I was on Mike from RTF on his show last year. We talked about this. This is an older clip, but I took it from his channel and sort of condensed it down to show you where I think Jordan Peterson is coming from as far as actually having a Catholic faith. And considering the fact that Scott Hahn basically says Jordan Peterson's about to go have a meeting with Peter Kraft, I mean, that's a huge deal. If you don't know who Peter Kraft is, he's one of the greatest Catholic philosophers alive today. And the thing about Peter Kraft that's incredible is that Peter Kraft is an expert in world religions. So he's a pious, Orthodox, conservative Catholic, but he understands, he's read the Quran, he's read Buddhism, he's read the Hindu scriptures, he's read all these things, he's opined on them, he's taught on them, he knows all the philosophy, he knows about psychology. He's got a lifetime of wisdom. I think he's in his mid to late 80s. He's still sharp and with it, thankfully. So he was going to sit down with Jordan Peterson. That's pretty fascinating. So we'll just play this clip here. This is actually from, Mike from RTF's show. And this is Peterson basically crying on camera, talking about the magnificence of basically believing in Christ. So this is about 4 minutes, but we'll watch this together.
That impulse is to the good. So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and the critic, my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion, Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because this, well, it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both,
say.
I think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch. You don't know what to make of something like time, because time has an ineradicably subjective element, and duration, which is different than time. I mean, time is kind of like the average rate at which things change, but duration is something like the felt sense of that time. And if you take away the subjectivity, it isn't obvious what to do with time. And I think physicists stumble over this all the time, so to speak. The attempts to clean up the mess have been rather half-hearted in my estimation.
Yeah.
And so I don't think Christians don't manifest this, and I'm including myself, I suppose, in that description. I do everything I can to remind myself of it all the time. And so does my wife. I mean, she's changed quite a bit as a consequence of her struggle with cancer, has become much more overtly religious, I would say. And, we say grace before our meal in the evening, and it's a very serious enterprise. And it always centers around gratitude, for the ridiculous volume of blessings that have been showered down upon us at a volume that's really quite incomprehensible. But despite that, despite that, I'm struggling with this because I don't know how to reconcile myself to the fact of constant pain.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's unjust, which is halfway to being resentful, which is not a good outcome. So we talked about the narrative and the objective touching. And so I wanted to touch on that again, is that, like, I understand C.S. Lewis's argument. And, I'm even inclined from time to time to think, well, I've got the choice between believing two impossible things. I can either believe that the world is constituted so that God took on flesh and was crucified and died and rose 3 days later. Or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that stretched into every atom of culture. And it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first, because the more you investigate the manifestations of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes. So,
okay, so a lot there, and that was from an episode last year. Couple things in the chat I want to get to first. Sarmad says, "Thank you for the super chat. Very good. If he converts, what kind of Catholicism will he be preaching? Modernism? I hope he converts, but it worries me a bit because he dabbles in a lot of nonsense and mixes it with the Christian faith." This is true, but the first thing that I'm interested in as far as his conversion is concerned is not his preaching, but his saving his soul. Not to say that people watching this show aren't, but he definitely hangs out with he hangs out with Bishop Barron. Maybe he'll become that I have no idea, but as we're going to go through some of these things that he talked about there, I think that he'll be a very, God willing, he converts and he goes to confession and all. I know he's baptized. He talks about in one of his books about being raised in like a conservative Protestant home. So I'm sure he was baptized, I think Presbyterian or something like that. So hopefully he had confirmation. So whatever Protestant groups still do confirmation. I don't think he was Anglican, but anyway, if he converts, I think he will be a very Orthodox believer. Now, we're going to go through some of the things that he said, though, because when Sarmad here talks about his nonsense, he's right. There is nonsense. Jordan Peterson has pushed, basically he's pushed Gnosticism. But you have to understand something, too. Jordan Peterson is, if we understand this in a theological perspective, he's working off of natural virtue, natural intelligence, and particular grace. And what does that mean? I'm not judging the man's soul, but I doubt he's living in a state of grace, in a state of sanctifying grace, because he hasn't been to the sacraments, I don't think, ever, except for baptism. And I would imagine he hasn't been to confession. And St. Alphonsus Liguori says that perfect acts of contrition are extremely rare. This doesn't mean he's a bad person. It just means, just the odds are is that he's living, figuring these things out through almost the strength of will, the magnanimity of his intelligence and his being well-read, while at the same time being humble enough to consider these questions and share them openly. And also, I would imagine he's praying. He talked about praying with his wife, and he's talked about praying other times as well. His wife prayed the rosary a bunch while she had cancer, actually. They talked about that. And he would pray with her. So, you pick up the rosary, good things happen. But I think that he would go towards a very conservative Catholic faith. And there's a few reasons why. So the first thing, he mentioned C.S. Lewis. And our friend here, Diane, says, he is so close to Christ. I hope so. I pray to God. Shout out, he'd be Canadian. Mike McCann is right that he's said that he might go ortho. Yeah, he could. I don't know. But he seems to be talking about Catholicism all the time. In fact, here's another quick clip of his that I downloaded earlier. And he's speaking specifically about Catholicism. And he could say Christianity is X, Y, and Z. He could say Orthodox Christianity is X, Y, and Z. But here is him talking about Catholicism with a particular emphasis.
Catholicism, I've gone through lots of Catholic cathedrals in Europe, and of course they're stunning creations, but they're Gothic and strange, and the doctrine is eerie and complex and surreal. And the biblical writings are the same. You think of a book like Revelation, for example. But I think that the Catholicism, that's as sane as people can get. Broadly speaking, is that we need a metaphysic, a narrative metaphysic to hold us together. And it has to be predicated on something that's transcendent and absolute. And if you lose that, then you'll fall for something else. You'll fall for something else. Or you'll fall for nothing, which is no better. And I learned that from reading Nietzsche, and I learned that from reading Dostoevsky. And this is the problem with the rationalists like Sam Harris and the atheists, Dawkins. They believe that if we dispensed with our superstitions, we'd all become Harris and Dawkins.
Yeah. There's something I want to get to from that too, but I want to get back to that first. So anyway, there he's talking about Catholicism being as sane as people get. He could have said Christianity. He could have said apostolic Christianity. He could have said sacramental Christianity or something like that. But he said Catholicism. So anyway, in that clip we watched earlier, he talks about C.S. Lewis. When somebody is, I don't know if anyone's ever picked up C.S. Lewis with an open heart, trying to find the truth about the Christian religion, the Christian faith. I don't know if anyone's ever picked up C.S. Lewis and then not gone the extra mile. There's just something about the way C.S. Lewis writes. One of the great intellects of our time. Even the Narnia stories. Read the Narnia stories, and you'll say, "My goodness gracious!" If you look through the first Narnia book, or the first one the first one written, but the second book chronologically, the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. He includes in there medieval Christian cosmology. You can actually look up, I think it's called the Narnia Code or something like that, or Decoding Narnia. There's so much in C.S. Lewis. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. He also, he was, C.S. Lewis was a master at boiling down really complex thoughts into really simple presentations, which is why he could write great children's literature that adults can also read. But he did that with his apologetics. Peterson talks about the historicity of Christ, and he says, on the one hand, it doesn't matter. And I know what he means by that. He goes, on the one hand, it doesn't matter, but also it really does matter. And he goes on to say, but what you have with Christianity is something like a myth, the mythological and historical, that sounds strange to those of us who are really tired of modernism, and we're really tired of people mythologizing. It's offensive to us when you call Christianity a myth. It's offensive when you call the Bible a myth, because what does myth mean in our modern day? Myth means, fantasy story that's not real. Myth means something you debunk, right? Myth means something that, these are the 5 myths about leasing a car and why you shouldn't do it or something. We think of myths as things that should be cast aside. But myth as a type of story is, there are not myths in the Bible, but there's a mythic element to that. And what does that mean? There's something about a myth in the traditional sense of the word where it is a 3-dimensional organic outgrowth of a story, to the point where the meaning of that story is imbibed in the spirit of a culture, and it's extremely powerful. And it's and bad myths can lead to bad things, obviously, but the genre of myth is actually much more complex than this thing. So there was another man who was converted when he understood the fulfillment of what myths had prefigured themselves to be in the Christian story, and it was C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis tells a story, or people who knew him as well tell the story, about how, C.S. Lewis was raised sort of Protestant Church of Ireland, Anglican Church in Ireland, and sort of lost his faith. He became basically an atheist rationalist. Then he became a theist, but the thing is, and then eventually a Christian. But in that interim where he was trying to consider whether or not to be a Christian or not, C.S. Lewis was really heavily into Norse mythology and Greek mythology. He actually studied the Greek classics in high school. He was tutored by an ex-professor, sort of homeschooling in an old school sense for high school. But anyway, what we would call high school ages, in his teenage years. And he read the great myths of antiquity in Greek and Latin. In fact, C.S. Lewis could write fluently in Greek. Anyway, one time him and Tolkien were talking. Tolkien, obviously the author of Lord of the Rings, and one of the Inklings, that group there, the group of writers, they would meet every Tuesday evening, I believe it was, Tolkien and Lewis's brother and some other people. And they were walking one night, and C.S. Lewis is teetering on this idea of converting, and he was worried that he was going to lose the meaning of the myths. Again, myth in the traditional sense. He was worried he was going to lose the profundity of what he had learned from these profound myths if he was going to stick to just one set of sacred texts, the Bible. And Tolkien, in his immense genius, said to him, "You don't understand, Jack." They called C.S. Lewis Jack. "Christianity is the myth that came true." Think about that for a second. Christianity is the myth that came true. What did he mean by that? He did not mean Christianity was a myth per se. What he meant was, since the fall of man, the yearning of the human heart to make sense of everything through stories, ancestral memories, grasping at things that were once understood about divine things but had become superstitious things, or commingling of pagan elements with traditional beliefs, and this sort of mess of stories that had turned themselves into these legends about these historical figures like Thor and Hercules and so forth, and we're not really sure if they're real, we're not really sure if they're not, but there's something to it where it points to this three-dimensional morality and history that you just can't put your finger on, and it leaves you unsatisfied in a sense. And Christianity was where the myth came true, where the person, the Superman that was pointed to, the God-man that was prefigured in these Greek myths, Achilles is kind of like a Christ figure. He's human and divine. Hercules is the same thing, that sort of thing. Obviously, these are strange versions. Thor is very similar. And these things are fulfilled in a sense. It's almost like these myths are, they're like prophecies from the Gentiles. We have the official prophecies in the Old Testament, of course, but then there's almost this whole world that's outside of the chosen people, and they too have this ancestral memory. Anyway, the myth came true with Christ. It's a very profound idea, and it's not modernist. It's not wacky. This is from Tolkien, okay? And this is what inspired the great writings of Tolkien and Lewis, is this idea that you could personify Christianity in a mythic sense through literature, which has been extremely powerful for people. Peterson then goes on to talk about synchronicity. Now, that term is totally a term that has been used by the New Age people, 100%. But it is not in and of itself a New Age term. So, what synchronicity means, it's a Jungian term, it's a psychological term. Basically, we would call it providence. Peterson talks about the objective world and the narrative world. What he's trying to say there is basically you have this meta, we would call the preternatural or supernatural reality, which comes into contact with the objective historical reality. In the Bible, we would call that something like the incarnation. We would also call it something like a miracle. This is where providence, this is where the metaphysical happenings of the divine mind or plan intersects with the mundane realities of human activity. These moments when you see them, and they're very fascinating. This was called Jungian synchronicity, and it means there's a the two worlds that exist kind of side by side, they are synchronized into one. It's a very powerful idea. It's been co-opted by the New Age people, and Jung had his problems. But it is a very fascinating idea, which I think we can see in Christian literature. Here is a really fascinating idea that Peterson talked about. I don't know if anyone has read Confessions by C.S. or by. Let's hear. Thank you, Mike, for sharing this quote. This is from Tolkien. Jack, when you meet a god sacrificing himself in a pagan story, you like it very much. You are mysteriously moved by it. Yeah, that's part of their conversation. But in any case, so if you haven't, I would recommend that everybody reads St. Augustine's Confessions. I don't have a copy anymore. I gave it away to someone one time. But I read that when I had just started coming back into the church. And I was struck by these statements from Peterson, because they smacked of St. Augustine. And you would only know this if you had read him. And he started talking about time. And Peterson said something so fascinating, which is easy to miss. But he said, there's the difference between time in the measured sense and time in duration. Mark Tazak says, read Confessions in 1971. Very good. Very good. Okay. St. Augustine touches on this idea in Confessions. And he has a quote where he says, if you don't ask me about time, I understand it. If you ask me to explain it, I don't understand it at all. I'm paraphrasing. And what he's referring to there is this ancient understanding of trying to make sense of time. And what you have is chronos and kairos. So chronos is where we get the term chronology. So if we talk about a chronology, we talk about, the actual chronological playing out of events. So the chronology of Canada is from a certain date until now, and we can see things on the chronological scale. But then within this chronological chronos, this chronological reality where things are measured, there are unmeasurable, immeasurable experiences. This is why, when you're a little kid and you say, wow, we just got here, Dad. Why are we leaving? Because you were having so much fun with your friends or your cousins or something that you just felt like you just got there, but actually it was 2 hours. On the other hand, I'm a goaltender, for example, when I play hockey, and if we're in a tight game and there's 2 or 3 minutes left in the game, why does two or 3 minutes feel like 45 minutes? It's unbelievable how slow those seconds go. There's something, it's not just, the rationalists would try to explain it away, but it's actually quite an impressive phenomenon. The reason why this is important from a Christian perspective is because on the one hand, and this is why St. Augustine had to deal with this. On the one hand, you look in the scriptures or in your life and you see these chronological moments. But on the other hand, you see these moments where so much information, so much divine reality is packed into such a short amount of time that it's inexplicably supernatural. There's something about it which is mysterious, which has baffled philosophers and theologians for millennia, and it probably will to the end of time. Because even that right there, the end of time, what does that even mean? We live inside of eternity, but at the same time, eternity has no beginning and no end. But we're in some sort of section of it. Anyway, this is Jordan Peterson is not just playing around with psychological phenomena. He's questioning the underpinning metaphysics of reality in the way that a man like Augustine did. And if we go back to my friend's comment earlier, super chat, thank you for that, where he basically says, what kind of Catholicism would Jordan Peterson espouse if he were to convert? Because, he's got some weird ideas. We have to remember where St. Augustine came from. St. Augustine came from paganism, and he came from the Arian or the Manichaean heresy. Manichaeanism was essentially a New Age cult. It had aspects of Christianity. It was in some ways rational. It had some interesting moral points, but it was a Gnostic cult, ultimately. It had degrees of people, almost like some sort of precursor to the things that led to Freemasonry. But it was highly intellectual. Although it was an intellectual dead end eventually for those who could see through it. And Augustine was the kind of fella who would look at the world and he would take things down to the studs. He would strip away all the possible, this is why we look to Aquinas and we have this sort of, Thomistic method. Augustine was a massive influence on Aquinas, and there's a reason for that. because Augustine came first, obviously. But Augustine's intellect is unmatched, in my opinion, in antiquity. And you can see this when you read City of God, where he basically just goes through all of the reasons why the Roman Empire fell and breaks down the illogicality of certain things, and breaks down the axiomatic assumptions of the Roman morality, which is why the empire fell. It's unbelievable. Anyway, St. Augustine came from a Gnostic cult, is what I'm saying, though. But he personally had a giant intellect. This is why he would go listen to St. Ambrose's lectures. This is why he was chosen to be like the voice of one of the voices of the emperor, and he was a rhetorician. It's very similar to Jordan Peterson. I'm not saying Jordan Peterson's going to be St. Augustine. I'm not making some stupid prophecy. What I'm saying, though, is St. Augustine was a giant of intellect, and he was adjacent to Christianity. And for years, he avoided it, but then his curiosity led him to really consider it, and then his humility actually, and he had certain tragedies that happened in his life that actually led him to having an actual real faith, and then he became St. Augustine. In addition, the whole time he had St. Monica praying for him, his mother. Well, Peterson, in a way, is going through something kind of similar. He's a giant of intellect. He's been adjacent to these Christian ideas for a long time, and he's finally started to deal with them humbly and try to consider them from a perspective of real faith. And one of the things that Peterson's gone through is he too has gone through great suffering. So Augustine didn't go through sufferings in health the way that Peterson has, but Peterson has gone through intense sufferings over the last couple of years. He had this meteoric rise where he was basically spreading these interesting yet sort of Gnostic ideas about the Bible. But then he reached this point where his fame was so remarkable. I mean, look at the views on the videos from Peterson from like 3 or 4 years ago. 3 years ago, there's like 50 million views. It's insane. It's almost as big as like stupid pop songs. That's, for a guy talking about virtue, that's remarkable. That's remarkable. But he had reached his limit. He had reached the limit of what his natural virtue would afford him. And he was struck down. He almost died. He had an illness it's even hard to get to the bottom of it, but it almost killed him, and it was debilitating, and it lasted months and months and months. His wife almost died as well and had a terrible cancer. All of this happened to Peterson just as the whole lockdown nonsense was happening. He went through an existential crisis. And he came out of that weeping about the fact that believing in Christ would change your life. You know, this is what God does, is he whittles a man down. Peterson is the kind of man who would whittle an idea down to its studs in order to understand it. And it seems like God has whittled Jordan Peterson down to his studs so he can finally understand himself. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. Peterson also talks about reading Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Well, if you look at Jordan Peterson's intellectual progression over the last few years, years ago he would talk about Nietzsche more favorably. I recommend when this is done, everyone looks up a podcast called Martyr Made. One of my mods, Joseph's going to be happy about that. But Martyr Made is a great podcast, and by a man named Daryl Cooper. Anyway, he has about a 5-hour podcast where he talks about Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and he goes through their lives. I can't even explain how he did it. It's absolutely fascinating. And he shows how Dostoevsky and Nietzsche essentially had very similar upbringings and very similar traumas. One went the way of the pagan and became very strange and weird and resentful and adolescent almost, Nietzsche. One went the way of the Christian, even though he still was a massive sinner, massively traumatized, and had his idiosyncratic, he had his idiosyncrasies. And he compares those two. So when Peterson here is showing, he's talking about the difference between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. What he's showing is that there are two paths that we can take in life. because Dostoevsky was basically an existentialist. He had a philosophical school that wasn't really reconcilable with what we would call classic Christian belief. And Dostoevsky looked at Christianity in his writings more from a psychological perspective than anything. And we see in this comparison between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, Peterson giving us how, on the one hand, you have despair, perversion, resentment, rationalism, and pride in Nietzsche. On the other hand, you have humility, repentance, forgiveness, failure. A lot of people don't know Dostoevsky had a massive gambling habit and lost his money like his whole money 5 or 6 times. He went to jail for a while. Terrible problems. But he had this unyielding zeal for the truth in literature, and it led him to an authentic conversion, and he died a faithful Christian. Anyway, fascinating stuff. There's more to Jordan Peterson's. It's almost like, if you know the dog whistles, if you know the stuff that he's talking about, he's filling his mind with the things that bring people home. Let's put it that way. He goes on to talk about, as well, attempts to clean up the mess in the 1960s. What he's talking about there is where the Catholic Church, failed around the time of the Second Vatican Council. Because when you look at Jordan Peterson's, it makes perfect sense that Peterson would understand this. If you look at how he has talked about psychology over the years, what he's basically promoted is a type of what we would call virtue ethics. So if you look at how he talks about when he was a clinician, and he would deal with, Sheila Gunn's on here. Hey, she says, Peterson's wife is Catholic. His wife has been praying the rosary and talking about God a lot. I wasn't able to find something where it says like she was confirmed or something, but yeah. Now, his wife also has videos talking about her mushroom trips. Again, we're not here to judge. But there is a story behind that, actually. In Canada, and maybe it's the same in the States, but there's a lot of experimental medicine going on with people who are in end-of-life care, and they give them psilocybin and psychedelics. I'm not recommending that. It might ultimately be a demonic plot because people become okay with their state in life and don't actually do things like go to confession before they die. But the idea is that when people are on death's door, when they were on death's door, they'll give them these psychedelic trips or something like that, and it makes them come to peace with things. I don't know. That's not good to come to peace with things and die not in a state of grace, but nonetheless, it's just something that's going on. And yeah, our friend here says, Kennedy, his daughter found God and has been reading the Bible. His daughter also needs to read a book on modesty, but yes, she's been reading the Bible. Yeah. In fact, there's a podcast of his daughter talking to some young Catholic guy talking about how he fell in love with the Blessed Mother. Seriously. And I don't particularly enjoy her show. I saw this clip, and Michaela basically says, "Whoa, what does that mean? The Blessed Mother?" And they just talk about Mary. Like, it's just crazy. And then, and Sarmad says, yes, he says, there's a podcast a few months ago talking about some certain, Gnostic, New Agey, pagan things. Yeah, but you know what? I'm going to, tell you a little personal story. When I was, years ago, when I was non-practicing, fallen away kind of Catholic, when you're just looking for the truth of things and you're not living in a state of grace. Sheila Gunreed for the win, of course. Let's pray the Petersons get there. That's what we do. Well, let's think about that for a sec. I mean, let's do over under here. Over under. How many millions of rosaries have been said for Jordan? Seriously, I mean, I know I've prayed for him. I'm sure probably everybody here has has thought about it, there's probably been millions of rosaries prayed for this guy. Anyway, it'll happen. But years ago when I was a non-practicing Catholic, I was looking for truth. So you're looking for things, and you're just trying to find the truth. And you don't really know how to go through the weeds of what is good for your spiritual health and what's not. But then once you start to live in a state of grace, those things just start to make sense. They just do. You don't need an argument for it. Once you start going to confession and you start living in a state of grace, you go, of course I'm not going to do that anymore. It doesn't even have to be explained to you. Just go, I'm just not going to do that anymore. But in any case, Peterson has talked about virtue ethics many times in the past. And one of his criticisms of what's happened in the church in the last 50, 60 years is that things have become overly psychological. And he basically, told Bishop Barron this on their show that you got to start talking about hell and judgment a little bit more. You can't just have all this mercy stuff. So it's interesting to see that one of his critiques, it's not as if Peterson is looking for some squishy, once saved, always saved, accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, which is great. I mean, accept him as your Lord and Savior. But he's not looking for something just like that. And then it's sort of like Jesus is your buddy. He's looking for the God of the Bible, which he's probably read front to back like 5 or 6 times. He's looking for the real Yahweh. And that comes like a thunderbolt. In his last bit, when he was talking about, he says to his friend there, Jonathan Pageau, he says, you're basically left with 2 hypotheses. One is that the Christian story is true, and it's in a sense preposterous. And what he means by that is just inexplicable outside of itself, which is true because it's revelation. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And God, became man, was killed, and rose from the dead. I mean, that's a pretty amazing story. On the other hand, though, he says the other option is basically that the most elaborate and incredible and unbelievable story that could ever be invented has permeated every single aspect of culture, and the whole thing is a hoax. And he makes the claim, and he says, that one's not more believable than the first one. Well, this is again proof that, in my opinion, Peterson has probably been reading C.S. Lewis, and he's probably been reading Peter Kraft. So the fact that he's met with Peter Kraft, as Scott Hahn revealed, is fascinating. Because Peter Kraft disseminates some of C.S. Lewis's famous arguments for the divinity of Christ. And he talks about the theory that Christ is either Lord, liar, legend, or lunatic. What does that mean? Well, if he's not God and believes he is, that's nuts. He's a lunatic. If he didn't exist and he's a legend, if he knew he wasn't God, then to say that he was would make him a liar. And if none of those 3 options are the case, then the fact is he's just Lord, liar, legend, or lunatic. But what's fascinating about this, and Peterson takes us all the way to its conclusion, you can tell by the way he's thinking. And Mark Tazak said, Peterson should read Archbishop Lefebvre. Everyone should. People will say Christ is a good moral teacher. No. If Christ is not God, he's not a good moral teacher, because he's either a lunatic, he's not real, or he's a liar, so he's not moral. The thing about Christ's claims is that, and one of the reasons why our society hates them, is because they're intolerant. Christianity is wonderfully intolerant. It is intolerant of lies. It is intolerant of error. It is intolerant of falsity. It only tolerates the truth. And it's as hard as a rock. And I think Peterson has realized this. Okay, I think I've given as much as a spiel as I could. I think Jordan Peterson is, there was another gentleman who had a similar conversion story. It was Malcolm Muggeridge. Look up Malcolm Muggeridge. He was basically an atheist, and then he went and visited Mother Teresa. And not only did he become a Catholic, but he went around, and a friend of mine who was in his 50s, he was there in the 80s when Malcolm Muggeridge was doing a lecture at Western University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. And he was asked what he thought one of the dumbest scientific fads would be that would go away and be ridiculed in the future, and he said it was evolution. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Before I go, thank you everybody for joining. The time is nigh if anyone has any questions. If you do have a question, please put 3 question marks or just sort of some sort of way that I can signify it in the front so I can actually see it. And if you don't have a question, that's fine. We can just end things. But if you're just joining us, we're talking about, I recommend you go back to near the beginning of the podcast and you can talk and you can see where I play this clip of what Peterson had been talking about his sort of conversion. Recently, he was visiting Steubenville University, and Scott Hahn posted on his Facebook that Peterson had a private meeting with Peter Kraft, who's one of the world's best Catholic philosophers, which is pretty fascinating. Josh says, do you think he'll become Roman Catholic or Byzantine? I actually think Roman. And the reason for that is because Peterson, even though he's got lots of love for the Eastern stuff, he strikes me as profoundly Western. He strikes me as profoundly Western, I think. And there's something to that from a cultural patrimony. You know, he's very much someone who's talked about the great English works of literature. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if he went to the Ordinariate or something like that. Anyway, but what's the video called of Michaela talking about Mary? I don't know, but if you look up Michaela Peterson, Virgin Mary, conversion, something like that, you'll find something. I remember finding it like that. Who would have a greater impact if converting, Peterson, Rogan, or Shapiro? I don't know. I think it's all relative. Joe Rogan, yeah, that's a fact. He's the kind of guy who, yeah, there's no arguments for a man like that. There's just prayers because he's extremely prideful in his arguments. Shapiro, I don't know. That would break the internet, I think. That would break the internet more than Rogan, I think, because Shapiro is like an outwardly Orthodox Jew. That's a really intense conversion there, considering the cultural history. And as far as where Michaela Peterson talks about the Blessed Mother, yes, that's where it was. She was talking to Seamus from Freedom Tunes. I remember that. Have I heard of Adam Green? I have not heard of Adam Green. Is Adam Green important? Or should I have heard of him? I don't know. Maybe I'll look him up. Okay. Well, anyway. Oh, do you know that Shapiro's wife is a doctor? Yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah. Ben Shapiro likes to push the true feminism thing. Anyway, pray for Jordan Peterson, not because he's your guru, not because he needs to go and be an evangelizer. Pray for Jordan Peterson so Jordan Peterson can save his soul. That's all that matters. Also, just realized Peter's son. Maybe he's going to be a Catholic under Peter. Is he an atheist? No, Peterson is not an atheist. He has there's lots of testimony for that. How he used to be one and he's not one anymore. All right, it's getting late here on the other side of the COVID curtain. Like and subscribe to this video on this channel. Check out our sponsor in the links in the description. I'm going to put that in the comments as well. of the video. Noble Gold. I'm not a huge financial guru, but I do know that gold is a good investment. Let's be honest about that. It's not going anywhere. And subscribe to the channel. Consider being a patron. $5 a month. If you're an American, $5 is $5 Canadian is what, like $2? Anyway, $2 American. So anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. And pray for Jordan Peterson. And maybe do some, I don't know. Oh, why don't we should do? This is what we should do. All the listeners. I can't remember which day it is, but the Novena to the Holy Ghost is coming up for Pentecost. So I guess it would start Thursday or Friday, because yeah, it's Ascension. Anyway, do the maybe try to find the Novena to the Holy Ghost, and do that, because that was how the nations were converted, was the arrival of the Holy Ghost, and only an infusing of God's knowledge is something that could break through the barriers of a man so smart as Jordan Peterson. Okay. Thank you to everybody for joining. And have a good night, and I will see you guys all soon.